Everyone thinks South Park just picks on Kyle for laughs. A running joke, nothing more. Cartman says something ugly. Kyle rolls his eyes. The show moves on. Matt Stone never saw it that way. And once you know why, you will never watch these episodes the same way again. The only Jewish kid in South Park, Kyle Broflovsky, is one of the four boys at the center of South Park, standing alongside Stan Marsh, Eric Cartman, and Kenny McCormick. Out of the four of them, Kyle holds a spot that none of the others share. He is the only one who is Jewish, and his family is the only Jewish family shown living in the town of South Park, Colorado. Every other family in town, no matter how strange or dysfunctional they might be, follows some form of Christianity. Kyle's house is different. It is the one home in town where the holidays, the food, the prayers, and the daily habits do not match anyone else's around him. This single detail, decided early on by the two men who built the show, shaped a huge amount of what Kyle became and set up one of the longest-running storylines in the history of the series. To understand why Kyle exists the way he does, it helps to look at where South Park itself came from. The show was created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, two friends who met while attending the University of Colorado in Boulder. Long before Comedy Central picked up South Park as a series, Parker and Stone made two short animated films together, both built around a simple joke: Jesus fighting a rival holiday figure. The first one, made in 1992, was called Jesus vs. Frosty. The second, made in 1995, was called Jesus vs. Santa. Both shorts featured a group of young boys who looked almost exactly like the versions of Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny that would later appear on television. These two shorts are widely considered to be the true starting point of South Park, since the characters, the crude cutout animation style, and even some of the humor carried directly into the show that debuted a few years later. When it came time to build out these characters into a full show, Parker and Stone drew heavily from their own childhoods. Trey Parker grew up in a small town called Conifer, Colorado, tucked into the mountains west of Denver. When he has talked about his time growing up there, he has described a hometown where there was, as far as he knew, only one Jewish student in the entire school. He remembered her being treated as something like the token Jewish person in the building, someone singled out simply because there was nobody else like her around. That memory stuck with him, and it became one of the building blocks for Kyle's character. The idea of being the only person of a certain faith in an entire town, standing out simply by existing, gave Parker a foundation for a character who would spend years feeling like an outsider in his own hometown, surrounded by people who meant well but rarely understood him. While Parker's memory of Conifer helped shape the concept behind Kyle, it was Matt Stone's own background that gave the character his actual identity. Stone was born on May 26, 1971, in Houston, Texas. His father, Gerald Whitney Stone, worked as an economics professor and came from an Irish Catholic background. His mother, Sheila Lois Belasco, was an Ashkenazi Jew with family roots tracing back to Russia and Poland. Ashkenazi Jews are Jewish people whose ancestors lived in Central and Eastern Europe, and many Jewish families in the United States today share that same background. Stone grew up with his younger sister, Rachel, in Littleton, Colorado, a suburb south of Denver, where he attended Heritage High School before heading off to college in Boulder. Because his mother was Jewish and his father was not, Stone grew up with a mixed household, something that gave him a personal connection to the idea of being partly inside a faith and partly outside of it, depending on how someone chose to define things. This mixed background is a big part of why Kyle Broflovsky exists the way he does. Kyle is loosely based on Matt Stone himself, and the show borrowed several personal details directly from Stone's own life to build the character. The most obvious one is Kyle's hairstyle. Kyle wears a big curly head of red hair tucked under a green hat, a style often nicknamed a Jewfro. That look is not something the animators dreamed up out of nowhere. Matt Stone actually had that exact type of curly hair in real life, and the character's design borrowed it directly from him. Stone also voices Kyle on the show, and in order to make the character sound like a child, the studio took a recording of Stone's own voice and raised its pitch on a computer, giving Kyle his higher voice while leaving Stone's real speaking voice much deeper and rougher in comparison. On top of the hair and the voice, Kyle even shares Stone's real birthday on the show, tying the character even closer to the man who created and voices him. Even Kyle's surname carries a piece of Stone's family history, since Broflovsky comes from a surname connected to his mother's side of the family. Unlike Kyle, who has no non-Jewish background in his family at all, Stone himself is only partly Jewish through his mother. This is an important difference between the real person and the character based on him. Stone's father was not Jewish, which means Stone grew up with one parent inside the faith and one parent outside of it. Kyle on the show does not share that same mixed setup. Both of his parents, Gerald and Sheila Broflovsky, are shown as fully practicing members of the Jewish faith, and the show treats Kyle's household as a single, unified Jewish family unit rather than a blended one. This means the show took Stone's personal connection to Judaism and turned the volume up, giving Kyle a background that leaned further into the culture and religion than Stone Stone's own upbringing actually did. Kyle's parents each bring their own personality to the household. Gerald Broflovsky works as a lawyer in town and is shown wearing a yarmulke, the small round cap worn by many Jewish men, in nearly every scene he appears in. He is written as a stern father, someone who cares deeply about doing the right thing, but who often comes across as strict or overly serious when dealing with his sons. Sheila Broflovsky, Kyle's mother, is known throughout the show for her strong interest in social causes and local politics. She is frequently shown speaking up at town meetings, organizing protests, or getting involved in whatever controversy happens to be gripping South Park that week. Together, Gerald and Sheila are presented as a loving but overprotective pair of parents, always trying to shield their children from the chaos of the town around them, even though that chaos almost always finds its way into their house anyway. Kyle also has a younger brother named Ike, who was adopted by the Broflovsky family and is originally from Canada. Despite Ike being much younger than Kyle, and despite the two of them being unrelated by blood, Kyle treats him with real affection and loyalty throughout the show. Whenever Ike ends up in danger, which happens surprisingly often given the strange plot South Park tends to build around its younger characters, Kyle is quick to step in and try to protect him. This bond between Kyle and Ike gives the Broflovsky household a sense of warmth that stands out against some of the colder or more broken family setups seen elsewhere in the town. One detail that sets Kyle apart even within his own extended family involves a cousin who shares his exact first name. Kyle has a cousin named Kyle Schwartz, and this shared name is actually pointed out directly within the show itself, something that almost never happens with other characters who happen to share names by coincidence. This makes Kyle unique in another small but specific way, since he is the only character on the show who has the same first name as someone he is actually related to by family, rather than just sharing a name with an unrelated stranger. Although Kyle's Jewish background feels like it has always been part of the show did not officially confirm his religion the moment it began. Kyle first appeared in those two earlier short films, Jesus vs. Frosty in 1992 and Jesus vs. Santa in 1995, well before South Park became a full series. When the show itself debuted on Comedy Central on August 13, 1997, Kyle's Jewish identity was present in the background of the character, but the show waited a little while before making it fully clear and confirmed on screen. Small hints appeared here and there in the earliest episodes, including brief nods in the episode Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride and a passing mention in An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig. However, the moment usually pointed to as the true, official confirmation of Kyle's faith came in the episode Mr. Hanky, the Christmas Pooh, one of the early episodes from the show's first season. That episode leaned directly into the culture clash of a Christmas-obsessed town containing one Jewish family, and it locked in Kyle's religion as a defined and permanent part of who he is, rather than something left vague or open to interpretation. Once that identity was set, it became one of the most consistent traits in the entire history of the show. Across every season, through countless changes in animation quality, storylines, and running jokes, Kyle has remained the one member of the core group of four boys who is not Christian. Stan, Cartman, and Kenny are all raised within some branch of Christianity, while Kyle stands apart as the only one raised Jewish. This single trait ends up shaping an enormous number of storylines over the decades, since it gives the show a built-in source of tension anytime religion, holidays, or cultural identity become the focus of an episode. Kyle's status as an outsider extends beyond religion in one other unusual way. Out of the four core boys, he is the only one who has never been shot over the course of the show. Kenny is famous for dying repeatedly in brutal and often ridiculous ways, and Stan and Cartman have both found themselves on the receiving end of gunfire at various points across the show's run. Kyle alone has managed to avoid this particular fate. While this detail has nothing directly to do with his religion, it adds another layer to the sense that Kyle occupies a slightly different space within the group than his three friends, always a step removed from certain patterns that repeat around him. The family's religious identity is also tied to a specific cultural background. Gerald and Sheila Broflovsky have been referred to as having Polish and Russian Jewish roots, which lines up closely with the real family history behind Matt Stone's own mother. This detail was not chosen randomly. It reflects the actual heritage Stone described for his own maternal side, meaning the show borrowed real, specific pieces of Stone's family tree and folded them directly into Kyle's background. Because of this, Kyle's Jewish identity on the show is not just a broad or generic label. It carries a specific cultural history behind it, one that traces back through Eastern Europe and into Stone's own bloodline. Despite this deep and specific background, the show has also portrayed Kyle as someone with a complicated relationship to his own faith. He is often shown feeling defensive about being Jewish, rather than openly proud of it, largely because his best friends are mostly Catholic, and he spends a lot of his time simply trying to fit in with them. Kyle also attends events tied to his religion, such as Jewish scouting activities, but the show frequently portrays him as having only a shaky grasp grasp of the deeper history, traditions, and rituals connected to his own faith. This is not because Kyle does not care. It is often shown as a result of his parents shielding him from some of the more difficult or complicated parts of Jewish history and religious practice, in an attempt to protect him, even though that protection sometimes leaves him underprepared when his faith becomes the center of attention at school or around town. This mixture of pride, confusion, and defensiveness gives Kyle's character a surprising amount of depth for a cartoon aimed at making people laugh. He is not written as a walking stereotype or a simple punchline. Instead, he comes across as a kid genuinely caught between two worlds, trying to hold on to an identity that makes him different from everyone else around him while still wanting to belong to the same group of friends he has grown up with. This balance between standing out and fitting in becomes one of the defining features of his character, something the show returns to again and again across hundreds of episodes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of this would carry the same weight without the presence of one particular classmate, someone who has made it his personal mission for decades to remind Kyle, at every possible opportunity, exactly how different he is from everyone else in town. Section 02, Cartman's favorite target. Out of every running joke South Park has kept alive across nearly 3 decades on the air, one has lasted longer and gone further than almost any other. That joke is Eric Cartman's endless string of insults, schemes, and outright hatred directed at Kyle Broflovsky for being Jewish. This is not a single storyline that wraps up in one episode. It is a pattern that stretches across the entire run of the show, built one small moment at a time, until it became one of the defining relationships in the whole series. Cartman does not simply dislike Kyle the way rival classmates might dislike each other over a disagreement or a grudge. He targets Kyle specifically because of his religion, using the word Jew itself in every way language allows, as a label, as an insult, and as a verb, often within the same conversation. To understand how deep this pattern runs, it helps to look past the handful of famous episodes most people already know, like the ones involving Mel Gibson, or the ones where Cartman fakes a disability to say slurs on television. Those stories get plenty of attention, and this script will cover them later. But long before either of those episodes aired, the show had already been quietly building smaller, stranger moments that show exactly how far Cartman is willing to go, and exactly how the show uses those moments to make him look foolish rather than powerful. One of the clearest early examples comes from an episode called The Entity, which aired on November 21st, 2001, as the 11th episode of the show's 5th season. In this episode, Kyle's cousin, a boy from Connecticut who is also named Kyle, comes to stay with the Broflovsky family while his mother recovers in the hospital. This cousin, later referred to by fans as Kyle Schwartz, is written as a walking pile of stereotypes, someone obsessed with money, constantly worried about his health, and completely unaware of how irritating he is to everyone around him. Kyle Broflovsky, worried about what Cartman might do once he meets a Jewish kid this easy to mock, offers Cartman $40 to keep his mouth shut for the length of his cousin's visit. For a little while, Cartman actually holds up his end of the deal, visibly straining with the effort of staying quiet. The moment does not last. During class, after their teacher repeats the word concentration while trying to get the cousin to focus on his work, Cartman blurts out a joke about sending him to a concentration camp, instantly losing the bet and exposing exactly where his mind goes the second he is given an opening. When Kyle confronts him about it, Cartman tries to claim he had no idea real concentration camps existed during World War II, a lie so obvious that nobody, including Kyle, believes it for a second. What makes this moment worth studying is not the joke itself, but the way the show frames it. Cartman is not shown as clever or in control of the situation. He is shown losing a bet within minutes because his own hatred is impossible for him to contain, even when there is actual money on the line. The show consistently sets Cartman up this way, letting his anti-Semitism cost him something every single time, whether that something is money, dignity, or in later episodes, entire schemes he spent an incredible amount of effort building. A second example, and one of the most direct in the entire series, shows up in an episode titled 2 Days Before the Day After Tomorrow, which aired on October 19th, 2005, as the 8th episode of Season 9. The episode follows Stan and Cartman after they accidentally destroy a massive beaver dam, causing a flood that wrecks the nearby town of Beaverton. As the disaster spirals out of control and the boys find themselves trapped in a burning building, waiting for a rescue helicopter, Cartman turns to Kyle and demands what he calls Jew gold, a small pouch of gold he insists every Jewish person secretly keeps hidden on their body at all times. Kyle denies having any such thing, but Cartman refuses to let it go, eventually pulling a gun on him and threatening to leave him behind unless he hands it over. Kyle eventually produces a small bag of gold, seemingly proving Cartman right, but rather than let Cartman keep it, Kyle throws the gold into the flooded wreckage below just as they are being pulled up into the helicopter, leaving Cartman screaming after it as it disappears into the water. This scene was built as a direct reference reference to an older film called Marathon Man, where a Nazi war criminal chases after diamonds stolen from Holocaust victims, meaning the show was not just making up a random stereotype on the spot, it was directly connecting Cartman's greed and hatred to the specific, real history of Nazis stealing wealth from Jewish victims during the Holocaust, dressing up a very old and very ugly idea inside a ridiculous cartoon disaster plot. Once again, the payoff belongs to Kyle rather than Cartman. Cartman spends the entire sequence obsessed with a stereotype he has convinced himself must be true, holding his friend at gunpoint over an imaginary treasure, only to watch that treasure vanish into floodwater the moment he finally gets his hands on it. He gets nothing out of the encounter except public humiliation, while Kyle walks away having proven that the entire premise Cartman built his threat around was hollow from the start. A third moment, smaller than the other two but just as telling, shows up in an episode called Butt Out, which aired on December 3rd, 2003 as the 13th episode of Season 7. The episode itself has nothing to do with religion. It follows the boys after they get caught smoking and try to shift the blame onto tobacco companies, which draws the attention of a real-life anti-smoking campaigner who arrives in town determined to shut down the local tobacco industry by any means necessary. In the middle of an unrelated argument about strategy, Kyle tries to warn Cartman that pushing the situation further will only make things worse for everyone, and suggests they simply stop and walk away. Cartman's response is to accuse Kyle of pulling something he calls the Serbian Jew double bluff, a made-up phrase that means nothing on its own but instantly reveals which direction Cartman's mind jumps whenever Kyle disagrees with him about anything, even something as small as whether to keep pushing a prank about cigarettes. The insult does not fit the situation. It does not need to. Cartman reaches for it anyway, because by this point in the show, that reach has become automatic. These 3 episodes, spread out across 4 years of the show's history, share a common thread. None of them are about Judaism, the Holocaust, or Jewish culture as a central topic. One is about airport security and a strange new invention. One is about a flood and a media panic over the causes of a natural disaster. One is about smoking and corporate blame. In every case, Cartman's anti-Semitism arrives as background noise, a habit so deeply built into his character that the show does not need a special occasion to bring it out. All it takes is an opening, a Jewish target standing nearby, and a few unsupervised minutes for Cartman to reach for the exact same well of hatred, regardless of what the episode is actually about. This casual, constant presence is part of what makes the running joke land the way it does. If Cartman only became anti-Semitic during a handful of special episodes built specifically around Jewish characters or Jewish holidays, the joke would feel like an occasional gimmick rather than a defining trait. Instead, the show treats his hatred as something baked into his personality at all times, ready to surface the moment he is given even the smallest excuse. There is also a specific reason the show built Cartman this way in the first place, and it goes back to a much older television character than anything found on South Park. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have both described Cartman's prejudice as being loosely modeled on Archie Bunker, the loud, narrow-minded father figure from the American sitcom All in the Family, which ran during the 1970s. Archie Bunker was written as a man whose bigotry was constantly on display, used by the writers of that older show to expose how ridiculous and small-minded prejudice actually looked once it was placed directly in front of an audience. Parker and Stone have referred to Cartman as a little Archie Bunker, borrowing that same basic idea and shrinking it down into the body of an 8-year-old boy from Colorado. The joke was never about proving Archie Bunker or Cartman correct. It was about placing a loud, confident bigot in full view and letting his own words do the work of making him look foolish. This connection to Archie Bunker helps explain why the show has been able to keep this joke running for so long without it ever really feeling stale. Cartman is not written as a villain who wins through his hatred. He is written as a small, insecure kid whose prejudice constantly trips him up, whether he is losing a bet over a careless remark, watching an imaginary treasure disappear into floodwater, or accusing his own friend of pulling off a made-up conspiracy with a name that sounds impressive but means absolutely nothing. Every one of these moments follows the same basic shape. Cartman reaches for hatred as a tool, and the show hands him a punchline instead of a victory. It is worth remembering that Matt Stone, who is part Jewish through his mother and voices Kyle, and Trey Parker, who voices Cartman, are the two people directly responsible for shaping every one of these moments. They are not simply allowing this dynamic to exist by accident. They built it, episode after episode, with a clear goal in mind. The joke was never meant to make actual anti-Semitism look clever or correct. It was built to make the person spouting it look small, petty, and often outright stupid, while the target of that hatred usually walks away having lost the least. This distinction matters a great deal, since it explains why the show has been able to return to this exact dynamic for close to 30 years without the joke ever really changing its shape. Cartman gets to be as openly hateful as the writers want him to be, precisely because the show never once lets him win because because of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. As the years went on, this same foundation ended up supporting much larger and far more elaborate storylines, some of which pulled in real public figures, real historical tragedies, and eventually, real-world conflicts still unfolding today. But every one of those bigger stories traces back to this same basic setup, first built quietly across smaller episodes like these, long before the show ever attempted anything as ambitious as sending Kyle to an actual Jewish summer camp. Section 03, Jubilee. Jubilee is the 9th episode of the 3rd season of South Park, and the 40th episode of the show overall. It first aired on July 28, 1999. This episode holds a special place in the story of Kyle Broflovsky, since it is the very first time the show sent Kyle deep into his own religious community, rather than simply having his faith mentioned in passing, or used as a punchline by Cartman. Interestingly, Cartman does not appear in this episode at all, marking the first time in the show's history that he was absent for 2 episodes in a row, since he also does not appear in the episode that aired directly before it. With Cartman removed from the picture entirely, the story instead focuses on Kyle, his younger brother Ike, and their friend Kenny McCormick, giving the show room to dig into Jewish community life without its usual source of anti-Semitic commentary standing in the middle of the scene. The episode takes place on the same night as 2 other South Park episodes from that same stretch of season 3, all connected by a single meteor shower passing over the town. This trio of episodes is often referred to by fans as the Meteor Shower Trilogy, since all 3 stories unfold at the same time but follow completely different groups of characters across town. While the adults of South Park, including Kyle's parents Gerald and Sheila, head off to a meteor shower watching party hosted by Mr. Mackey, Kyle and Ike are sent off in the opposite direction, toward a summer camp event for Jewish children called Jubilee. Before they leave, there is a knock at the Broflovsky family's door. It turns out to be Kenny McCormick, who has nowhere else to go for the night and asks to tag along. Gerald and Sheila hesitate at first, but eventually agree to let Kenny join Kyle and Ike for the trip to camp. On the drive over, Sheila takes the opportunity to explain the basics of the Jewish faith to Kenny, since he has little to no background knowledge of Judaism going into the event. Kyle also warns Kenny directly that he needs to make sure nobody at camp finds out he is not actually Jewish, setting up the central tension that will eventually unravel later in the story. Once they arrive, the camp splits the children into 2 separate groups based on age. The older kids, referred to as Jew Scouts, head into the main meeting hall, which the show names Mashugana Hall, a word borrowed from Yiddish that basically means crazy. The younger children, including Ike, are sent to a separate area known as the Squirt's Lair, supervised by their own designated adult leader. Inside the main hall, the older scouts go through an initiation ritual that involves placing a large bell over a new member's head and striking it as loudly as possible. Kenny, trying his best to play along and avoid drawing suspicion, ends up making the entire process worse for himself, as his attempts to dodge the disorienting effect of the ringing bell only seem to amplify how dizzy and confused he becomes. As the night moves forward, the older scouts gather to prepare for the arrival of Moses, who appears to them not as a human figure, but as a giant, glowing, levitating dreidel, floating in the air and speaking directly to the assembled group. The scouts present him with an offering of homemade arts and crafts projects, including soap sculptures, as part of the ceremony. It is during this moment that Moses senses something is wrong and singles out Kenny, declaring that an outsider who does not belong is present among them. Kenny is quickly identified as the one Moses is referring to, and despite Kyle's earlier warning and Kenny's best efforts to blend in, the truth comes out. Kenny is banished from the camp entirely, forced to walk home along the side of the road on his own, thumbing for a ride from passing cars, while a convoy of federal agents rushes past him in the opposite direction, heading toward the very meteor shower party where Kyle's parents are staying, believing wrongly that some kind of dangerous group is gathered there. While Kenny is out on the road trying to find his way back, the story back at camp takes a much darker turn. One of the camp's elders, a man named Garth, is revealed to be secretly working against Moses and the rest of the Jewish community at Jubilee. Garth belongs to what the show describes as an anti-Semitic sect of Judaism, a group that rejects Moses entirely and instead worships a figure named Haman. Haman is not a made-up character invented for the episode. He comes from real Jewish history and scripture, specifically the Book of Esther, where he served as a Persian official roughly 24 centuries ago who planned to have every Jewish person living within the Persian Empire killed. According to that history, his plan was ultimately stopped by Esther, a Jewish woman who had become the wife of the Persian king, and Haman was eventually executed on the very gallows he had built for someone else. His downfall is still remembered today through the Jewish holiday of Purim, which celebrates the moment his plot against the Jewish people failed. By pulling this specific historical villain directly into the plot of Jubilee, the episode grounds its otherwise absurd storyline in a piece of real religious history, rather than inventing inventing a threat from nothing. Garth's plan involves capturing Moses and sealing him inside a small conch shell, trapping him there so that Haman can be summoned in his place to take control of the Jewish community at camp. Garth manages to pull this off successfully, locking the rest of the elders and scouts inside a cabin at gunpoint while he works to bring Haman fully into power. With every adult and older scout trapped and unable to help themselves, the only chance of stopping Garth rests entirely with the group of young children still out in the woods, including Ike and the rest of the squirts, along with Kenny, who has not yet made it home. Before any of this unfolds, the episode spends time following the squirts and their supervisor, an adult named Shlomo, who spends much of the night trying to track down a wild bear that had been spotted nearby earlier in the episode. Shlomo is motivated less by concern for the children's safety and more by his own desire to earn a specific badge that would allow him to be promoted from supervising the youngest squirts to leading the older scouts instead. His plan does not go smoothly. The bear ends up capturing the squirts one by one, carrying them off into the woods, which understandably worries the remaining children and adults back at camp. However, the reveal at the end of this subplot turns out to be far gentler than expected. The bear was never trying to harm the children at all. It turns out that the day happened to be her cub's birthday, and she had simply been gathering the squirts to bring them along so her cub would have friends to celebrate with. Kenny, who has been kicked out of the main camp and left wandering nearby, eventually crosses paths with the bear, the cub, and the missing squirts in the middle of the woods. Once he learns what is actually happening back at the main camp, with Garth holding everyone hostage and Haman's summoning already underway, Kenny and the group of young squirts head back toward camp together to try to stop it before it is too late. When they arrive, the squirts work together as a team, standing on top of one another to form a makeshift ladder tall enough to reach the keys needed to unlock the cabin where the adults and older scouts have been trapped the entire time. With the door finally unlocked, Kenny rushes toward the conch shell where Moses remains sealed away. Rather than finding a clever or delicate way to free him, Kenny simply smashes the shell open using his own head, a desperate and violent act that succeeds in releasing Moses at the cost of Kenny's own life in the process. Moses, now freed, immediately turns his attention to Haman, who has just been summoned and is beginning to take hold of the situation. Moses destroys Haman on the spot and also kills Garth, ending the anti-Semitic elders' plan for good and restoring order to the camp. In the aftermath, rather than treating Kenny's death as a tragedy to simply move past, Moses declares that the Jewish community at camp will gather together every single year from that point forward to honor what Kenny did for them. He announces that this new annual tradition will involve exactly the same kinds of activities the scouts had already been doing that night, including soap sculptures, macaroni pictures, and paper plate bean shakers, turning Kenny's sacrifice into the founding reason behind a brand new yearly celebration held in his memory. Before this final resolution, the episode also finds room for a smaller, quieter moment involving Ike. At one point earlier in the story, Ike creates a macaroni picture depicting the Last Supper, the famous scene of Jesus sharing a final meal with his disciples before his death, originally painted by Leonardo da Vinci centuries earlier. The Squirt's supervisor immediately points out how inappropriate it is for Ike to be recreating a distinctly Christian religious scene at a Jewish summer camp, a small joke that highlights just how young and unaware Ike is of the religious lines he is accidentally crossing, even while surrounded by adults trying to teach him about his own family's faith. Behind the scenes, Jubilee holds a specific place in the memories of the show's creators. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have described it as one of their favorite episodes to work on, largely because of the timing surrounding its production. It needed to be finished and ready to air about a month after the release of the feature film South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, which had already demanded an enormous amount of their time and energy. Exhausted from that larger project, Parker and Stone approached Jubilee with a much looser, more relaxed mindset than usual, deciding not to overthink the plot and instead simply write something strange and entertaining without worrying too much about whether every piece made perfect sense. Rather than seeing this as a weakness, both creators later pointed to this experience as an important moment in figuring out the writing process that worked best for the show going forward, favoring quick, instinctive storytelling over long, overly careful planning. Jubilee stands apart from many of the other Jewish-themed episodes covered elsewhere in this video, since it is the only one built entirely around Kyle's own community rather than his ongoing conflict with Cartman. There is no anti-Semitic classmate standing at the center of the plot, no outside figure mocking Kyle's beliefs, and no attempt to teach a lesson about prejudice coming from someone outside the Jewish community. Instead, the episode turns its attention inward, imagining a hidden, extreme faction existing within Judaism itself, one willing to betray its own people entirely in pursuit of power. By building its villain from within the community rather than outside of it, and by pulling that villain's inspiration directly from real Jewish scripture, Jubilee manages to explore Jewish identity from an entirely different angle than the episodes that came both before and after it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Word of the camp's strange, deadly night never quite makes it back to Kyle's parents, who spend the entire episode believing their sons and Kenny simply attended a normal night of scouting activities. That gap between what the adults believe happened and what actually happened at camp becomes even more pointed once the show turns its attention toward an entirely different kind of clash, one that pulls Kyle out of his own community altogether and drops him directly into the middle of a real-world controversy still fresh in the news at the time it aired. Section 04, The Passion of the Jew. The Passion of the Jew is the third episode of the 8th season of South Park and the 114th episode of the show overall. It was written and directed by Trey Parker and originally aired on March 31st, 2004. To understand why this particular episode exists, it helps to look at what was happening in the real world in the months leading up to it, since the entire storyline was built as a direct response to a genuine controversy that had been dominating entertainment news for weeks before the episode ever aired. In February of 2004, actor and director Mel Gibson released a film called The Passion of the Christ, focused entirely on the final 12 hours of the life of Jesus, showing his arrest, torture, and crucifixion in extremely graphic detail. Before the movie even hit theaters, it had already become the center of a massive public argument. Critics and religious scholars raised serious concerns that the film leaned into old anti-Semitic ideas by placing heavy blame on Jewish religious leaders for Jesus' death, ideas that have historically been used to justify violence and discrimination against Jewish communities for centuries. This concern grew even louder once journalists started looking closely at Gibson's own family background. His father, Hutton Gibson, had a long public history of making statements denying or minimizing the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people by Nazi Germany during World War II. Just 1 week before The Passion of the Christ hit theaters, Hutton Gibson gave a radio interview where he claimed that most of what people understood about the Holocaust was fiction, arguing that the death camps physically could not have killed as many people as history records. When Mel Gibson was directly asked by television journalist Diane Sawyer whether he agreed with his father's views on the Holocaust, he refused to clearly answer, saying only that his father was his father and that he needed to leave the subject alone. This refusal to distance himself from his father's statements only added more fuel to an already massive news story, with major Jewish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League speaking out publicly about their concerns regarding both the film and the Gibson family's history. This was the exact climate South Park stepped into when it aired The Passion of the Jew just over a month after the film's theatrical release. Rather than commenting directly on the real-world controversy through news analysis or debate, the show chose to filter the entire situation through its own characters, using Kyle and Cartman as stand-ins for two very different reactions playing out across the country at the time. The episode begins with Cartman, who has apparently already seen The Passion of the Christ an enormous number of times, repeatedly pushing Kyle to go watch it himself. Cartman frames this as some kind of test, insisting that once Kyle sees the film, he will finally understand and admit that Cartman has been right about Jewish people all along. Kyle initially resists, uninterested in giving Cartman any kind of validation, but he eventually agrees to watch the movie. Once he does, the experience hits him incredibly hard. The graphic violence and suffering shown in the film disturbs him deeply, and rather than simply finding the movie upsetting on a basic emotional level, Kyle begins spiraling into intense guilt, apparently absorbing the film's framing that Jewish people bore direct responsibility for what happened to Jesus. His guilt becomes so overwhelming that he starts having nightmares, imagining himself and other Jewish people laughing while participating in Jesus' death, images that clearly reflect exactly the kind of harmful old stereotype that critics feared the real movie might reinforce in audiences who did not know better. Consumed by this guilt, Kyle goes to speak with a local Catholic priest named Father Maxey, hoping to understand more about how Christians view the events depicted in the film. Father Maxey explains to him that Christianity, at its core, centers around the idea of atonement, meaning taking responsibility and seeking forgiveness for wrongdoing. Rather than easing Kyle's guilt, this explanation seems to make things worse in his mind, since he now becomes convinced that the right thing to do is somehow apologize on behalf of Jewish people everywhere for what happened to Jesus. Kyle brings this idea directly to his own rabbi and the wider Jewish community in South Park, suggesting that they should collectively apologize for the crucifixion. Unsurprisingly, this suggestion does not go over well with the adults in his community, who see no reason why they should apologize for events from thousands of years ago that they had nothing to do with, and who try to explain to Kyle that a movie, no matter how popular or graphic, does not need to be taken as a literal historical record deserving of that kind of response. While Kyle spirals deeper into guilt and confusion, Cartman is having the exact opposite reaction. Rather than being disturbed by the film's violence, Cartman becomes completely completely enamored with it, treating Mel Gibson almost like a religious figure himself. He begins praying directly to a poster of Gibson hanging in his room, treating the actor and director as some kind of prophet who has finally exposed the truth Cartman believes he has been trying to tell everyone about Jewish people his entire life. Fueled by this obsession, Cartman decides the time has come to take real action. He organizes a Mel Gibson fan club, recruiting earnest, well-meaning adults from around town who believe they are simply joining a group dedicated to celebrating a movie they found moving and meaningful. What these adult members do not initially seem to realize is that Cartman, dressed in a uniform closely resembling a Nazi officer's outfit, is using the fan club as cover to spread a very different message entirely, one calling for the extermination of Jewish people. During a rally outside the local movie theater, Cartman leads members of his fan club in chanting phrases in German, phrases that translate to lines about it being time for revenge and calling for the extermination of Jewish people. The townspeople following along have no idea what they are actually saying, mistakenly believing they are simply repeating the ancient language spoken in the film itself, when in reality, they are unknowingly chanting genuine hate speech directly modeled on actual Nazi rhetoric. At the same time this is unfolding, Stan and Kenny have their own storyline running through the episode, one built around a much simpler and more mundane complaint. Unlike Kyle, who is emotionally devastated by the film, and unlike Cartman, who becomes obsessed with it, Stan and Kenny simply think the movie is bad and want their money back. Frustrated by how disturbing and unpleasant they found the experience, the two boys decide the only fair solution is to demand a refund directly from Mel Gibson himself. This decision sends them on an increasingly ridiculous journey, eventually leading them to travel out to Gibson's home in Malibu, California, to confront him face to face. Once they track him down, the episode presents Mel Gibson as a deeply unstable, almost cartoonishly unhinged figure. He first denies having their money, then reveals he needs it to build his own church, at one point randomly breaking into song about his love for Jesus while playing a banjo. When Stan and Kenny push back, insisting they simply want their $18 returned, Gibson's behavior escalates dramatically. He strips down to his underwear, insists the boys are welcome to torture him however they like, but makes clear that no amount of torture will convince him to give the money back voluntarily. When the boys still refuse to physically harm him, Gibson pulls out a gun and begins chasing them through his own house, eventually locating his wallet, allowing Stan and Kenny to grab their refund and make a run for the exit. Rather than letting them leave peacefully, Gibson commandeers a massive tanker truck, closely resembling a vehicle from the 1981 action film Mad Max 2: The Road Warrior, and begins pursuing the boys through the streets, at one point even lifting a specific line of dialogue directly from that older film during the chase. Back in South Park, Cartman's rally and fan club continue building momentum, drawing in more members of the local Christian community who remain completely unaware of what they are actually participating in. The situation escalates until it draws the attention of the town's Jewish community, who confront the group directly outside the theater still showing the film, demanding the movie be pulled from screens. This standoff eventually pulls in Mel Gibson himself, who arrives in town driving his stolen tanker truck, still pursuing Stan and Kenny. The chaos that follows brings every storyline in the episode crashing together at once, mixing Cartman's rally, the Jewish community's protest, and Gibson's unstable pursuit of the two boys into one large, escalating public scene. Eventually, Gibson's own instability becomes impossible for even Cartman to ignore or excuse. Rather than remaining the noble figure Cartman had built him up to be in his head, Gibson is shown humiliating Cartman directly and publicly, at one point defecating on him in front of the crowd that Cartman had spent the entire episode trying to organize and lead. This moment strips away any remaining dignity from Cartman's carefully built movement, exposing both the absurdity of his hero worship and the fact that the man he had chosen to model his hatred after was never a stable or reliable figure to begin with. Around the same time, Kyle manages to find his own way out of the guilt that had consumed him throughout the episode. Rather than accepting the film's framing as historical truth demanding an apology, Kyle instead comes to understand that the Passion of the Christ reflects far more about Mel Gibson's own personal obsessions and beliefs than it does about the actual historical or religious meaning of Christianity as a whole. With this realization, Kyle is able to let go of the guilt that had been building throughout the episode, recognizing that one filmmaker's graphic, violent interpretation of events does not represent the entire faith or every person who practices it. The episode closes with its two central storylines resolved in very different ways. Kyle, having worked through his guilt with support from people around him, returns to a more balanced understanding of his own faith, rather than the extreme, self-blaming reaction the film had originally triggered in him. Cartman, meanwhile, is left publicly humiliated, having built an entire movement around a man who turned out to be unstable, violent, and ultimately willing to degrade Cartman himself the moment it suited him. Where Kyle's storyline ends with him gaining perspective and moving past a painful painful experience, Cartman's storyline ends with him losing control of the very thing he tried to build, echoing the same basic patterns seen throughout many of the show's other episodes, covered elsewhere in this video, where Cartman's hatred consistently leads him toward humiliation rather than any kind of real power or validation. The real-world reaction to this episode proved almost as interesting as the episode itself. Given that the episode directly mocked both Mel Gibson and the broader cultural moment surrounding his film, some expected pushback from Jewish organizations who might see the subject matter as too sensitive or too soon after the original controversy to turn into comedy. Instead, the response from at least one major watchdog organization was largely positive. Kenneth Jacobson, who served as an associate national director for the Anti-Defamation League, an organization that had been one of the most vocal critics of the original film, spoke to reporters about the South Park episode directly. While noting that he was not typically a regular viewer of the show, he described the episode's jokes at the expense of Jewish characters as feeling like classic South Park, explaining that the show's entire approach treats every group as a potential target for its humor, rather than singling anyone out unfairly. He went on to explain that the basic message underlying the episode, that Gibson's movie represented a deeply flawed way to teach people about Christianity, struck him as a completely reasonable point for the show to make, and he noted that the violence depicted in the episode was so exaggerated and over the top that it became almost cartoonish rather than genuinely disturbing. According to his account, a number of people within the organization who watched the episode came away with a similar reaction, generally approving of how the show had handled such a difficult and recent controversy. This reaction highlights something important about how The Passion of the Jew was constructed. The episode does not ask its audience to side with Cartman's anti-Semitic rally or to take Mel Gibson's unstable behavior seriously as some kind of hidden truth. Every single storyline built around hatred or extreme reaction within the episode ends in failure or humiliation. Cartman's rally collapses into public disgrace. Gibson himself is portrayed as dangerously unstable rather than heroic. Even Kyle's initial reaction, driven by guilt rather than hatred, is eventually shown to be an overcorrection rather than the appropriate response to a single controversial movie. The episode uses exaggeration and absurdity as its main tools, stretching every reaction to the real-world controversy to its most extreme, ridiculous possible version, allowing viewers to see just how irrational each extreme position looks once pushed far enough. It is also worth remembering that this episode arrived at a moment when the real-world debate over the film was still actively unfolding in newspapers, talk shows, and public statements from religious leaders around the country. Rather than waiting years to look back at the controversy with distance, South Park chose to respond almost immediately, airing its take on the situation while the original news story was still fresh in the minds of its audience. This immediacy is part of what gave the episode its impact at the time, allowing it to directly engage with a national conversation that many viewers were already following closely, rather than referencing a controversy that had already faded from public attention. Looking at The Passion of the Jew, alongside the earlier episode, Jubilee reveals just how differently the show chose to explore Jewish identity depending on the story it wanted to tell. Where Jubilee looked inward, imagining a hidden threat rising from within Kyle's own religious community, The Passion of the Jew looks outward, pulling in a real public figure, a real controversy, and real historical accusations that have been used against Jewish people for generations, then filtering all of it through the reactions of children processing something far too large and complicated for them to fully understand. Kyle's guilt, Cartman's obsession, and Stan and Kenny's simple desire for a refund each represent a different, exaggerated version of how real people across the country were reacting to the same movie at the exact same time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This episode also marks a shift in scale for Cartman's anti-Semitism. Earlier moments stayed small, contained to a classroom or a single bet. Here his hatred becomes an organized movement, complete with recruited followers and a uniform modeled on Nazi imagery. That same pattern would grow even bigger once Cartman fakes a medical condition just to spread the same hate on television without consequences. Section 05, Le Petit Tourette. Le Petit Tourette is the 8th episode of the 11th season of South Park and the 161st episode overall. It was written and directed by Trey Parker and first aired on October 3rd, 2007. The episode served as the mid-season premiere of season 11, marking the start of the second half of episodes that year. According to Parker, the episode was not originally planned as the premiere for that stretch of the season. It had actually been produced ahead of time as a bank episode, meaning it was finished early so the production team could have a few extra days off later in the season. This detail matters because it shows the episode was not treated as some kind of special centerpiece event, even though the subject matter it tackled turned out to be one of the more talked about storylines in the show's history. The idea behind the episode came from Trey Parker and Matt Stone's decision to explore what would happen if Cartman Cartman discovered a medical condition that let him say absolutely anything he wanted without facing any consequences. Both creators felt strongly that the episode would lose its entire point if the network used its usual censorship bleeps over Cartman's dialogue, since the whole premise depended on the audience actually hearing every single word Cartman gets away with saying. This led to lengthy discussions with Comedy Central about exactly how the episode should be handled, including one suggestion to air it at midnight as a special standalone broadcast rather than in its usual time slot. In the end, the network allowed Parker and Stone to use nearly every curse word available, with the single exception of one particular word, which remained bleeped out even in this episode. The episode was given a rating of TVMA, with additional language and violence labels attached, making it one of the first episodes in the show's history to carry those specific extra rating markers, reflecting just how much uncensored language the network agreed to let through for this particular story. Before the episode ever aired, word of its subject matter reached the Tourette Syndrome Association, a real organization dedicated to supporting people who live with the condition. Ahead of the broadcast, the organization publicly stated that it fully expected the episode to come across as offensive and insensitive toward people actually living with Tourette syndrome. Despite these early concerns, once the episode aired, the organization's own president, a woman named Judith Ungar, later admitted that the episode had actually been surprisingly well researched. She pointed out that the show had gone out of its way to include accurate information about the condition, delivered through scripted moments involving parents, a doctor, other children, and the support group session shown later in the episode. At the same time, she voiced a real concern that the episode's heavy focus on one particular symptom, a rare form of Tourette syndrome that causes some individuals to blurt out curse words involuntarily, might leave casual viewers with the mistaken impression that cursing is the main or only symptom associated with the condition, rather than one relatively uncommon symptom among many possible ones. She also expressed worry that children who actually have Tourette syndrome might end up mocked or bullied by classmates who had seen the episode and misunderstood what they were watching. The story begins with Cartman shopping at a toy store, where he happens to encounter a boy named Thomas, who genuinely has Tourette syndrome. Tourette syndrome is a real medical condition that can cause a person to make sudden movements or sounds, sometimes including words, that they cannot control. Watching Thomas blurt out words without anyone punishing him for it, Cartman becomes fascinated, realizing that having this same condition would let him say whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, without ever getting in trouble. He immediately bursts into a joyful song about his discovery, treating the entire situation like he has stumbled onto the greatest opportunity of his life. The song he sings closely mirrors the famous tune from the story of a boy touring a magical chocolate factory after finding a golden ticket, repurposed here to celebrate Cartman's discovery of a way to avoid consequences for his own words, rather than winning any kind of real prize. Cartman wastes no time putting his plan into action. A few days later, his mother, Leanne Cartman, takes him to see a doctor, genuinely believing her son has developed Tourette syndrome after hearing him suddenly start swearing at home. The doctor examines him and diagnoses him with the condition, apparently accepting Cartman's performance at face value. Cartman, playing the part of a worried, misunderstood child, tells the doctor that school staff will not understand what is wrong with him, and the doctor reassures him that the school will be properly informed about his condition ahead of time. Armed with this official diagnosis, Cartman walks through school the very next day, loudly swearing at everyone he passes, including staff members like Principal Victoria, who react with concern and sympathy rather than punishment, since they now believe his outbursts are a symptom of a condition he cannot control. Once Cartman realizes just how much power this fake diagnosis gives him, he begins using it specifically to target Kyle. Rather than sticking to random swearing, Cartman starts screaming anti-Semitic remarks directly at Kyle's parents, using his supposed medical condition as a shield against any consequences for doing so. This escalation turns what started as a scheme for personal freedom into another direct extension of Cartman's ongoing hatred toward Kyle and his family, giving him what he believes is a perfect excuse to say the exact kinds of things he has wanted to say for years without ever having to face punishment or public shame for it. Kyle, understandably furious about watching Cartman get away with open anti-Semitic abuse toward his own parents, is eventually forced into an uncomfortable position. Kyle's own parents make him apologize to Cartman for reacting angrily to the insults, since as far as the adults in town are concerned, Cartman is a sick child who cannot help what comes out of his mouth. Kyle is also sent to attend a support group for children who have Tourette syndrome, where he tries to explain to the other kids that Cartman is not actually dealing with the same condition they live with, but is simply faking it for his own amusement and gain. The other children in the group react with genuine confusion rather than agreement, insisting that nobody would ever want to fake having Tourette syndrome purely for fun, since living with the real condition is nothing to treat lightly. This moment highlights one of the sharper points buried inside the episode's comedy, showing genuinely sick children struggling to understand why someone would pretend to have their condition just to avoid getting in trouble for being cruel. As Cartman's fake diagnosis spreads through town, he decides to take his scheme to an even bigger stage. He reaches out to Chris Hansen, a real television journalist, known at the time for hosting segments on the news program Dateline NBC, where he worked with law enforcement to catch adults attempting to meet children for sexual abuse, an ongoing series called To Catch a Predator. Cartman convinces Hansen to feature him in a special segment about living with Tourette syndrome, but his actual plan is far darker than simply telling his story. Cartman intends to use the live national broadcast as a platform to deliver a full anti-Semitic hate speech, all while being treated by the audience and by Hansen as a brave, sympathetic child bravely opening up about his disorder. Rather than facing backlash for what he plans to say, Cartman expects to be praised for his honesty and courage, using the assumption that he cannot control his own words as total cover for saying whatever hateful things he wants on television in front of a huge audience. Before this plan can fully play out, the episode takes an unexpected turn inside Cartman himself. At a support gathering held the night before his television appearance, Cartman begins delivering a gloating speech, mixing in intentional swear words along with the anti-Semitic remarks he has been rehearsing. Partway through, something shifts. After spending so long deliberately saying whatever came to mind without any filter at all, Cartman finds that he can no longer turn that filter back on, even when he wants to. He begins blurting out deeply embarrassing personal secrets that have nothing to do with his fake performance, admitting out loud that he still wets his bed at night and that he cries because he does not have a father in his life. Rather than feeling powerful, Cartman is horrified to discover that losing control of his own mouth is not enjoyable at all once it starts revealing things he actually wanted to keep hidden. At one point, a nearby adult tries to reassure him by pointing out that of course he cannot control what he says, since he supposedly has Tourette syndrome, only for Cartman to admit with visible dread that his condition seems to have gotten far worse than before, since he used to only blurt out comments mocking Jewish people on purpose, and now he cannot stop himself from revealing things he never intended to say at all. Panicked, Cartman tries to cancel his upcoming appearance on Dateline, but Chris Hansen refuses to let him back out. Hansen tells Cartman a story about a previous situation involving a man who tried to avoid appearing on one of his segments, explaining that things did not end well for that man in the end. Using intimidating language and clear insinuation rather than an outright threat, Hansen makes it clear that backing out is not an option Cartman is allowed to consider. Terrified by the implication that something terrible might happen to him if he refuses to show up, Cartman admits that he has wet himself out of fear and finds himself trapped into going through with the broadcast after all, despite no longer having any control over which humiliating truths might come spilling out of his mouth once the cameras start rolling. While Cartman spirals toward his own unraveling, Kyle has been working on a plan of his own alongside Thomas, the boy with real Tourette syndrome from earlier in the episode. Thomas is not simply annoyed by Cartman faking his condition for personal gain. He is genuinely worried that watching Cartman get praised on national television for saying outrageous things while claiming to have Tourette syndrome will convince other people that the disorder is something fun or worth imitating, rather than a real medical condition that affects people's lives in serious ways. Together, Kyle and Thomas come up with a plan to disrupt the live broadcast before Cartman ever gets the chance to deliver his hate speech to a national audience, without either of them realizing that Cartman himself has already privately given up on going through with his original plan. Their method for sabotaging the broadcast borrows directly from the same show Chris Hansen is famous for. Just as To Catch a Predator lures adults seeking to harm children into a set location using online conversations, Kyle and Thomas use the internet to lure a group of real predators into showing up at the studio where Cartman's segment is set to be filmed live, tricking them into believing they are walking into an ordinary meeting rather than a trap. The moment these men step inside and spot Chris Hansen standing there, they immediately understand they have been caught on the very show they feared most. Rather than being formally arrested, every single one of them reacts by shooting themselves on the spot, one after another, throwing the entire studio into chaos as the terrified audience flees the building. One of these men reacts with pure confusion in his final moment, apparently having believed he was walking into a completely different and much more innocent kind of gathering before realizing the truth about where he actually was. Chris Hansen also flees the scene, running directly into Thomas outside the studio. Thomas, still experiencing an actual tic caused by his real Tourette syndrome, ends up swearing loudly at Hansen in the middle of the panic. Rather than reacting the way he treats the predators he usually confronts, Hansen is intimidated by the outburst and runs away, telling Thomas that nobody talks to him that way and that he intends to tell someone about it. A nearby classmate named Craig, watching this entire exchange unfold, reacts with genuine admiration, amazed that Thomas managed to scare off a grown adult television host, and even asks if the two of them can hang out sometime afterward. With the studio now empty and the broadcast completely ruined, Kyle finds Cartman and confronts confronts him, expecting to find him furious and humiliated over losing his chance to deliver his planned hate speech on live television. Instead, Cartman reacts in a way Kyle does not expect at all. Rather than showing anger, Cartman hugs Kyle and thanks him, explaining that Kyle's interference actually saved him from a much worse fate, since he had already lost control of what might have come out of his mouth once he stepped in front of the cameras. Cartman tells Kyle he plans to find a psychiatrist to help him learn how to control his own thoughts and words going forward, then walks away happily singing the same joyful song from earlier in the episode about his discovery of Tourette's syndrome, seemingly having learned nothing at all from the entire ordeal. Watching him go, both Kyle and Thomas react with the exact same exhausted response, realizing that despite everything that just happened, Cartman still does not appear to understand or care about the real consequences of what he tried to do. Once the episode aired, television critics offered a genuinely mixed set of reactions to it. Travis Fickett, writing for IGN, gave the episode a score of 7.5 out of 10, describing it as an amusing entry that delivered classic Cartman behavior, including his opportunistic decision to fake a real medical condition purely so he could say whatever he wanted without facing punishment. Fickett noted that while the episode was not among the show's very best work, it managed to stretch its central joke further than he initially expected it could. A separate reviewer for the entertainment site 411 Mania landed somewhere in the middle, giving the episode a score of 6.5 out of 10 and describing it as a hit-and-miss experience overall, arguing that the episode's first half suffered from relying too heavily on a single repeated joke, while the second half demonstrated exactly why the series continued to stand out as one of the strongest shows on television at the time. A reviewer for the AV Club offered a more mixed take as well, giving the episode a grade of C+, praising its fresh angle on a medical condition the show had never previously explored, along with its mockery of Chris Hansen's real television segments, but criticizing the episode's second half for losing momentum once Cartman's storyline shifted toward his national television appearance, specifically pointing to the repeated joke involving the Predators shooting themselves as one element that felt overdone by the episode's end. Despite this mixed critical reception at the time, audience response to the episode proved considerably more positive over the years that followed. On the review aggregation website IMDb, the episode holds a rating of 8.9 out of 10 based on several thousand user votes, reflecting strong ongoing appreciation among fans for its bold approach to humor and its character-driven ending. Several individual fan reviews single out the closing moment between Kyle and Cartman as a particularly meaningful part of the episode, noting that the show rarely allows audiences this close a look at the more vulnerable, hidden side of Cartman's personality that he normally keeps buried beneath his usual scheming and cruelty. Some fans have specifically pointed to this quieter emotional layer as one of the reasons the episode has remained a standout entry from that particular season of the show, even years after its original broadcast. This episode adds an important piece to the larger pattern running through Cartman's history with antisemitism, since it shows him actively searching for a loophole that would let him say the worst things he could think of without ever facing consequences for saying them. Unlike earlier examples covered in this video, where Cartman's hatred simply slips out during ordinary moments, this episode shows him deliberately engineering an entire fake medical diagnosis, specifically as a tool built for that exact purpose. The fact that his plan ultimately collapses, not because of outside punishment, but because his own mind turns against him once he removes every filter he has, adds a strange twist to the usual pattern. For once, Cartman is not stopped by Kyle directly exposing his hatred to the public. He is stopped by his own inability to handle the freedom he worked so hard to create for himself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Just as this scheme eventually turns against Cartman from the inside, the show would later imagine an entirely different kind of turn for him, one that does not involve faking anything at all, but instead asks what might happen if Cartman's hatred toward Kyle somehow pushed him in the exact opposite direction he had spent his whole life fighting against. Section 06, Fantastic Easter Special. Fantastic Easter Special is the 5th episode of the 11th season of South Park and the 158th episode overall. It was written and directed by Trey Parker and first aired on April 4th, 2007. The episode was built as a direct parody of The Da Vinci Code, a hugely popular novel and film from the mid-2000s that imagined a hidden conspiracy buried inside centuries of Christian history and art. Rather than centering its story on the crucifixion or the resurrection, the way earlier religious episodes had, this one dug into a much smaller, stranger question. It asked why children decorate eggs for Easter in the first place, then used that simple question to build an entire secret society storyline, stretching from South Park all the way to the Vatican. The story begins with Stan Marsh coloring eggs at home with his family, growing frustrated that nobody can give him a clear answer about what decorating eggs actually has to do with Jesus or Easter. His father, Randy, only offers a vague, unsatisfying response, so Stan's storms out of the house, determined to find real answers somewhere else. He heads to the South Park Mall, where he tracks down a man dressed as the Easter Bunny and demands to know the truth. The bunny brushes him off, telling him it is just Easter and that he should simply go along with it, then makes a mysterious phone call the moment Stan walks away. Almost immediately afterward, Stan finds himself being chased through town by a group of grown men dressed in bunny costumes. When Stan finally makes it home, he discovers that his own father is connected to the very group chasing him. Randy explains that he belongs to a secretive organization called the Hair Club for Men, a group that has guarded a hidden truth about Easter for generations. The building where this club meets closely resembles a Masonic hall, and much of the group's ceremony borrows heavily from the actual rituals associated with Freemasonry, a real fraternal organization known for its private meetings and symbolic traditions. At the center of the club's devotion sits a live rabbit named Snowball, treated by the members with a level of reverence usually reserved for religious icons. Randy brings Stan along to the club's headquarters so he can be formally initiated into the group and finally learn the secret himself. Before the initiation can be completed, the ceremony is violently interrupted by a group of ninjas who storm the building. The Hair Club members scramble to protect Snowball, and in the chaos, Randy hands the rabbit directly to Stan, telling him to run. As Stan escapes with Snowball, he witnesses the ninjas and their leader executing a Hair Club member who tries to resist, then watches as the same leader begins interrogating his own father. This leader is revealed to be William Anthony Donahue, a character based directly on a real public figure who led an organization called the Catholic League, known in real life for speaking out against media he considered offensive or disrespectful toward Catholicism. In the episode, Donahue is written as the exact opposite of that public image, portrayed instead as a violent, power-hungry extremist willing to kill and lie his way toward controlling the secret the Hair Club has protected for centuries. The real William Donahue was born on July 18, 1947, in Manhattan, and has served as president of the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights since 1993. He holds a doctorate in sociology from New York University and describes his organization's main purpose as defending the Catholic Church against what he considers unfair insult and defamation in American media and entertainment, rather than simply pushing back against ordinary criticism of church positions on public issues. By the time Fantastic Easter Special aired in 2007, Donahue had already been a frequent and vocal critic of South Park itself for several years. He had publicly criticized earlier episodes of the show, including one titled Bloody Mary, which involved a statue of the Virgin Mary, and another titled Trapped in the Closet. Just 1 year before this episode aired, Donahue had also publicly attacked Parker and Stone over an entirely different controversy, after Comedy Central refused to let the show broadcast an image of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. Rather than defending the network's decision, Donahue instead accused Parker and Stone themselves of hypocrisy for going along with the restriction while still mocking Jesus Christ in the same episode, at one point publicly calling them cowardly for accepting the network's rules regarding Muhammad while continuing to push boundaries elsewhere. Despite this ongoing history of public criticism aimed at the show, Donahue reportedly took his portrayal in Fantastic Easter Special in good humor rather than treating it as another target for outrage. The day after the episode aired, he wrote in his organization's newsletter that he had no idea why Parker and Stone had chosen to portray him as a heartless thug, joking that he stood convicted with no defense to offer, before adding that he needed to get back to business since someone had just taken liberties with the Easter Bunny. According to later reporting, Donahue even kept a framed still image from the episode displayed in his own office, showing his animated counterpart wearing the Pope's mitre after seizing control of the church within the episode's story. With his father captured and no idea what to do next, Stan runs straight to Kyle's house, hoping his friend might know something useful about Easter that could help him understand what is happening. Kyle, being Jewish, tells Stan plainly that he has no real knowledge of Easter traditions at all, since the holiday belongs to a faith he does not practice. He is hesitant to get involved in something this dangerous over a holiday that has nothing to do with him, but Stan eventually convinces him to help anyway. This moment mirrors the same setup used in earlier episodes covered previously in this video, where Kyle's outsider status within Christian tradition becomes the exact reason he gets pulled into a Christian storyline in the first place, even though the holiday driving the plot belongs to a faith that is not his own. Together, Stan and Kyle track down a man named Professor Teabag, a character whose name and role directly parody a similar figure from the Da Vinci Code named Teabing. Teabag explains that the famous Renaissance artist Leonardo da Vinci was secretly a member of the Hair Club for Men, and that his painting of the Last Supper originally depicted St. Peter not as a man, but as a rabbit. According to Teabag, the real St. Peter was never human at all, and the entire structure of the Catholic Church, including the design of the Pope's mitre, the tall pointed hat worn during formal ceremonies, was secretly built to accommodate rabbit ears rather than a human head. He explains that Jesus intended for the position position of Pope to always belong to a rabbit rather than a man, specifically because rabbits cannot be corrupted by power and authority the way humans consistently are. Over the centuries, the church supposedly buried this truth and placed a human in charge instead, while the Hair Club for Men continued quietly decorating eggs as a way of keeping the secret hidden inside Da Vinci's original artwork. Before T-Bag can explain much more, Donahue's ninjas track the boys down and attack the mansion, killing T-Bag's butler in the process. T-Bag manages to help Stan and Kyle escape by placing Marshmallow Peeps candy inside a microwave, causing an explosion large enough to destroy his entire mansion, killing both himself and the attacking ninjas in the process, and buying the boys just enough time to get away. With nowhere else to turn, Stan and Kyle travel directly to the Vatican, the headquarters of the Catholic Church, hoping to find real answers and rescue Randy along with the rest of the captured Hair Club members. Once there, they encounter Pope Benedict, a character based on the real Pope holding that position at the time the episode aired. Benedict listens as Jesus himself, who had been killed in Iraq earlier in the episode and resurrected shortly afterward, arrives to explain the full truth directly. Jesus confirms that he did intend for popes to be rabbits from the very beginning, using the ongoing corruption and extremism shown by Donahue as living proof of exactly why he never trusted humans with that kind of unchecked religious power in the first place. Rather than accepting this explanation, Donahue reacts with fury, insisting that Jesus is speaking against the church and must be executed for it. Pope Benedict, horrified by the suggestion, refuses outright, telling Donahue that killing Jesus is not something a true Christian would ever consider doing. Enraged by this pushback, Donahue seizes the Pope's mitre for himself, declares himself the new Pope, and orders his ninjas to capture everyone present, including Benedict and Jesus. As his men lock Kyle and Jesus together inside a holding cell, Donahue refers to the two of them dismissively as the two Jews, openly grouping Jesus in with Kyle under the same anti-Semitic label, despite the fact that the episode treats Jesus as a distinct, resurrected figure standing directly opposed to Donahue's plans. Trapped inside the cell together, Jesus explains to Kyle that his ability to intervene and stop Donahue only works while he is dead, meaning the only way for him to escape and act again is for Kyle to kill him first so he can resurrect somewhere outside the locked cell. Kyle immediately resists the idea, telling Jesus flatly that killing him is not something he can simply do, directly referencing his own Jewish identity and the deep discomfort that history creates for him personally. Jesus insists there is no other option and that taking his own life would count as blasphemy within his own faith, leaving Kyle as the only person able to carry it out. Reluctantly, Kyle agrees, but only after securing one specific condition from Jesus first, insisting that Eric Cartman must never find out that he was the one who killed him. Jesus agrees to keep the secret, and Kyle carries out the act, allowing Jesus to resurrect just outside the cell moments later. With Donahue preparing to publicly execute Snowball in front of Randy, Stan, and the remaining Hair Club members, the newly resurrected Jesus appears in the crowd and kills Donahue by throwing a five-bladed weapon closely resembling a similar weapon from the 1983 fantasy film Cruel. With Donahue finally dealt with, Snowball is properly installed as the true Pope, fulfilling the secret T-Bag had described earlier and restoring the arrangement Jesus had originally intended for the church. Once the episode aired, it received strong praise from television critics almost immediately. IGN reviewer Travis Fickett gave the episode a perfect rating of 10 out of 10, calling it a masterpiece and describing it as controlled comic chaos that only South Park seemed capable of managing so consistently. The 11th season of the show as a whole went on to earn a rare 100% approval rating on the review aggregation site Rotten Tomatoes, based on 6 separate critic reviews collected for that season. One reviewer for the entertainment site Pop Matters specifically singled out this episode alongside another from the same season, praising both for delivering some of the show's clearest statements on organized religion, while noting with some surprise that neither episode relied on lazy or reflexive religion bashing to make its point. Even outside of television criticism, the episode later received recognition from Time magazine, which included it on a list ranking the 10 best films or television episodes ever made about the life of Jesus, specifically praising how closely its conspiracy plot echoed both the Da Vinci Code and, in a smaller detail, the way its own version of a classic Easter rabbit song had been reworked into Latin lyrics for the episode's own version of church ceremony. This episode stands apart from the others covered in this video because Kyle's Jewish identity becomes the specific detail that turns him into the one person capable of ending the entire crisis, rather than the reason he becomes a target for mockery or hatred. His discomfort over killing Jesus is treated as completely understandable given his own beliefs, and his insistence on secrecy from Cartman afterward shows just how aware Kyle remains of exactly how Cartman would react if he ever learned what happened inside that cell. At the same time, Donahue's casual grouping of Jesus and Kyle together as the two Jews shows how quickly outside hatred can attach attach itself to Kyle regardless of the situation, even inside a storyline built around Christian mythology rather than Jewish identity itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Where this episode used ancient scripture and a fictional secret society to explore how far anti-Semitic thinking can twist even a religious authority figure meant to represent kindness and forgiveness, the show's next major dive into this same subject would take a very different shape entirely, trading rabbits, ninjas, and the Vatican for a much smaller, stranger threat tied directly to one of Judaism's own holidays. Section 07, Chupacabra. Chupacabra is the 4th episode of the 16th season of South Park and the 227th episode overall. It was written and directed by Trey Parker and first aired on April 4, 2012. The episode centers on a made-up creature Cartman invents himself, blending the real Mexican legend of the Chupacabra, a mythical blood-drinking animal said to attack livestock, with a fabricated connection to the Jewish holiday of Passover. That year, Passover happened to fall during the same week as Easter, giving Cartman the perfect opportunity to combine both holidays into one elaborate lie aimed squarely at ruining things for everyone around him. The episode opens with Kyle waking up and heading to the kitchen for breakfast, only to find Cartman already sitting there, deep in conversation with Kyle's own mother about the upcoming holiday of Passover. Kyle, immediately annoyed by Cartman's presence in his own home, tells him to leave. Before walking out, Cartman warns Kyle that a strange blood-sucking creature has apparently just been spotted somewhere in South Park, hinting that this creature might have something to do with the arrival of Passover. Around the same time, the children of South Park gather in the park to sign up for the town's big annual Easter egg hunt, an event sponsored by the local grocery store, Superfoods. Cartman wastes no time spreading his new story to every kid who will listen, warning them about a creature he calls the Chupacabra, describing it as a blood-drinking monster that specifically preys on children during Passover. In describing the creature to the other kids, Cartman compares it to a Sasquatch, only a little more greedy, a small detail that hints at exactly how he plans to use the fear he is stirring up for his own benefit, rather than out of any real concern for anyone's safety. Kyle immediately pushes back, telling the other boys that only liars or genuinely stupid people would actually believe in something called a Chupacabra. Despite Kyle's objections, several of the other children start taking Cartman's warning seriously anyway, worried enough that the safety of the upcoming Easter egg hunt starts to feel genuinely uncertain. Cartman's real motivation behind the entire scheme has nothing to do with protecting anyone. His actual goal is to scare every other child away from participating in the Easter egg hunt so that he alone can collect every single chocolate egg for himself without any competition. To make his story more convincing, he recruits Butters Stotch, one of the more gullible kids in town, to help him sneak out at night and film supposed evidence of the Chupacabra lurking in the woods. This nighttime filming sequence directly parodies a genre of reality television built around paranormal investigators and monster hunters, closely echoing shows that send small teams of self-styled experts into dark forests at night, searching for legendary creatures using shaky handheld cameras and night vision equipment. The episode even frames Cartman's finished footage with a title card resembling the opening credits from the 1982 horror film The Thing, directed by John Carpenter, giving his amateur monster hunting video an oddly polished, cinematic look despite being made entirely for the purpose of tricking gullible adults. Once he has footage he considers convincing enough, Cartman takes it directly to the executives running Superfoods, hoping to convince them to cancel the public event entirely and let him handle collecting the eggs on his own instead. As part of negotiating with the Superfoods representatives, Cartman also manages to talk them into flying him out to the Bahamas, using the supposed danger of the Chupacabra as an excuse to get himself taken on a company-paid trip, which conveniently gives him an opportunity to ride down a water slide themed around the lost city of Atlantis once he arrives. A detail that further underlines just how little Cartman's scheme has to do with protecting anyone, and how much it has to do with squeezing whatever personal benefit he can out of the situation. As his lie spreads further through town, Cartman starts losing control of the story he originally invented, purely for his own benefit. Late one night, frightened by the possibility that a real Chupacabra might actually exist, Cartman ends up hiding inside the South Park church alongside Butters, Craig Tucker, and Tolkien Black, who are supposedly guarding the entrance. After hearing a loud noise nearby, the other boys panic and run off, leaving Cartman alone inside the church as something outside continues trying to get in. The threat turns out to be nothing supernatural at all. It is simply Mr. Billings, the owner of Superfoods, along with several of his employees, who kidnap Cartman, dress him up in a rabbit costume, and leave him chained up out in the park as a supposed sacrifice meant to satisfy the very creature Cartman himself invented. Billings and his employees then show up at Kyle's front door, informing him that a sacrifice is currently being held out in the park in order to appease the Chupacabra. Kyle heads over to find find Cartman chained up exactly as described, offering to set him free under one simple condition: that Cartman finally admit out loud that the Chupacabra was never real to begin with. Rather than taking the easy way out of his own situation, Cartman cannot resist making a mocking joke about Hebrew culture instead of simply admitting the truth, leading Kyle to walk away and leave him chained up alone in the park. Shortly afterward, a team of Sasquatch hunters, working on an unrelated search for the legendary creature known as Bigfoot, stumble across Cartman, still dressed in his rabbit costume, and chained up in the woods. This sequence parodies a specific style of paranormal reality programming built around teams of amateur investigators tracking large, mysterious animals through wooded terrain, closely mirroring popular shows from that same era built around exactly this kind of Bigfoot search. Mistaking him for some kind of bunny man rather than a person, one of the hunters shoots him with a tranquilizer dart, instantly knocking him unconscious. While sedated, Cartman experiences an intense hallucination that transports him back to ancient Egypt, placing him directly inside the biblical story of Passover itself. Within this dream, Cartman finds himself face to face with Kyle, who explains the real story behind the holiday, describing how the Pharaoh's refusal to free the Hebrew people led God to unleash a series of increasingly violent plagues against Egypt, including swarms of frogs and the eventual deaths of every Egyptian firstborn son. As Kyle walks him through this history, Cartman reacts with a mixture of confusion and disbelief, at one point asking why God would resort to something as strange and seemingly unfair to animals as making it rain frogs, and later questioning why God would harden the Pharaoh's heart specifically to keep him from freeing the Hebrew people sooner, only to then punish him harshly for refusing. Cartman, disturbed by the sheer brutality of what Kyle describes, reacts with genuine horror at how harsh and unforgiving the story turns out to be, particularly once the vision shows Hebrew families marking their doors with the blood of a slaughtered lamb to protect their own households from the plague, striking down every firstborn son in Egypt. Still trapped in this frightening vision, Cartman is eventually found and rescued by the real Kyle, who cuts him free from his chains in the waking world and walks him home to recover from the entire ordeal. The following day, the town's Easter egg hunt is already well underway when Cartman suddenly bursts through the crowd shouting that he is alive, grabbing a nearby microphone to deliver an impromptu sermon about what he now believes was a genuine Passover miracle that saved his life the night before. During this outburst, Cartman goes so far as to shout that Jesus is a lie in front of the gathered crowd, publicly rejecting the very holiday the egg hunt itself is built around. Rather than being moved by his story, the surrounding children mock him, calling him a heathen before simply returning to their egg hunt without paying him any further attention. Feeling rejected and dismissed by the very people he had spent the entire episode trying to manipulate, Cartman approaches Kyle one final time. In a surprisingly sincere moment, he tells Kyle that he finally understands, even if only briefly, what it feels like to be oppressed and dismissed by people around him, and claims that he now genuinely believes in Judaism after everything he just experienced. Given the entire scheme began purely as a selfish lie designed to steal chocolate eggs from other children, this sudden claim of real religious belief lands as one more example of Cartman completely failing to learn any lasting lesson from his own actions, echoing the exact same pattern seen in earlier episodes covered throughout this video. Critical reaction to the episode after it aired proved decidedly mixed. IGN reviewer Max Nicholson gave the episode a score of 6.5 out of 10, praising some of the earlier sequences, including the parody of paranormal hunting shows and Cartman's more absurd moments, such as his outburst denying Jesus during the egg hunt, but ultimately criticizing the episode as a whole for lacking a clear focus and failing to fully deliver on its own promising premise of South Park tackling Passover directly. A separate reviewer writing for the AV Club offered a more favorable take, awarding the episode a grade of A- and pointing out that the episode, like much of the show's history, leaned on Cartman's antisemitism as one of its central comedic engines, arguing that the humor works specifically because of how genuinely ignorant Cartman remains even while orchestrating elaborate schemes, since he manages to be clever enough to build complicated plans while still completely misunderstanding the very prejudice he claims to hold. That same reviewer noted that the show pushes this exaggeration so far that it loses its power to feel genuinely offensive and instead becomes simply absurd, adding that Cartman's schemes so consistently backfire on him that the pattern itself becomes part of the show's ongoing appeal. Other reviewers were less charitable. One review published shortly after the episode aired described it as something of a disappointment overall, arguing that while certain moments landed well, including the parody of paranormal investigator shows and Cartman's tranquilizer-induced vision of the 10 plagues, which the reviewer felt offered genuinely interesting commentary on the differences between Hebrew and Christian understandings of God, too many of the episode's other jokes fell flat and relied on generic humor about Jewish culture that failed to add much of anything new. Another separate review specifically criticized the ending, arguing that the message suggested by Cartman's sudden conversion conversion to Judaism following his hallucination felt oddly hollow, partly because the vision itself mostly consisted of disturbing imagery involving slaughtered lambs and dying children, rather than anything that meaningfully explained why Cartman's beliefs might have genuinely shifted by the episode's end. Chupacabra brings something slightly different to the larger pattern of Cartman's relationship with Judaism compared to the episodes covered earlier in this video. Rather than building a public movement or exploiting a fake medical condition, this episode shows Cartman inventing an entire piece of folklore purely as a tool for personal greed, one that spirals so far out of his control that he ends up briefly living through a version of the very religious story he had been mocking the whole time. His claim of newfound belief at the end never carries any real weight, since nothing about his underlying character or motivations has actually shifted by the time the episode ends. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That shallow, temporary claim toward faith stands in sharp contrast to a much bigger storyline the show would eventually build years later, one that imagines what might happen if Cartman's connection to Judaism stopped being a passing lie told for personal gain, and instead became something the show treated as a lasting, permanent part of who he is. Section 08, South Park Post. COVID South Park Post COVID is an hour-long special released exclusively on the streaming service Paramount Plus on November 25th, 2021, which happened to be Thanksgiving that year. Rather than continuing the show in its usual present-day setting, this special jumped the entire cast of characters 40 years into the future, showing what life in South Park might look like for the original group of kids once they had grown into fully aged adults. The special was intended as the first half of a larger story, with a direct sequel titled South Park Post-COVID: The Return of COVID, following just a few weeks later on December 16th, 2021, continuing and eventually resolving the storyline set up in the first special. Both specials are framed around the world dealing with the long-term consequences of the real COVID-19 pandemic, imagining a future where new variants and repeated lockdowns have permanently reshaped how people in South Park live their lives. Against this larger science fiction backdrop, one particular storyline running through both specials focuses entirely on Eric Cartman, revealing that the boy who spent decades of screen time tormenting Kyle Broflovsky over his Jewish identity has, by this point in the future, become an actual practicing member of the Jewish faith himself. In this future version of South Park, Cartman has converted to Judaism and now leads his own congregation as a rabbi based in Colorado Springs. He wears a tallit, a traditional Jewish prayer shawl, everywhere he goes, and his once familiar blue and yellow winter hat has been swapped out for a kippah, the small round cap worn by many observant Jewish men. Cartman is shown to be married to a Jewish woman named Yentl, and the two of them have 3 children together, named Moishe, Menorah, and Hakam. Rather than presenting this transformation as some kind of subtle background detail, the special makes Cartman's new life a major visual and emotional centerpiece, showing him fully at home in his new identity, happy in his marriage, and deeply connected to the religious community he now leads. For Kyle, now an adult himself, living alone in his childhood home, with his parents nowhere to be found in this future timeline, Cartman's transformation lands as anything but a pleasant surprise. Having spent decades of his life as the target of Cartman's anti-Semitic jokes, threats, and outright schemes, Kyle finds it almost impossible to believe that his old tormentor could have genuinely changed in such a complete and sincere way. Rather than accepting Cartman's new life at face value, Kyle becomes convinced that the entire conversion, the marriage, the children, the religious leadership role, must be some kind of long-running con specifically designed to mess with him one final time. This suspicion sends Kyle into a state of ongoing frustration and anger throughout the special, unable to simply enjoy or accept the idea that Cartman might have actually grown into a better person after everything that happened between them as children. Adding a layer of irony to this entire situation, the special reveals that Kyle himself has drifted away from his own religious practice over the decades separating his childhood from this future version of his life. At one point, Kyle openly admits that it has been a long time since he last prayed, showing that while Cartman has moved dramatically closer to embracing Judaism, Kyle has moved in the opposite direction, becoming far less connected to the faith that once defined so much of his identity as a child. This role reversal gives the storyline an unusual shape compared to the other episodes covered throughout this video. Rather than simply repeating the same basic dynamic of Cartman attacking Kyle's faith from the outside, the special flips the entire relationship, placing Cartman inside the religion Kyle grew up practicing, while Kyle himself stands somewhat removed from it. At one point during the special, circumstances force Kyle into a situation where he ends up temporarily hosting Cartman's entire family inside his own home. Rather than treating this as an opportunity to finally make peace with his old rival, Kyle instead tries to kick Cartman's wife and children out of the house entirely, still unable to shake his deep suspicion that something manipulative must be lurking underneath the surface of this apparently happy family. In one particularly particularly pointed moment during this confrontation. One of Cartman's own children compares being forced to leave Kyle's home to the historical exile of the Jewish people from the Holy Land, a comment that highlights just how fully immersed in Jewish identity and history this next generation of the Cartman family has become, raised with an awareness of their own religious and cultural background that stands in sharp contrast to how casually anti-Semitic their father once was, toward that exact same identity decades earlier. Throughout the first special, the show deliberately keeps the audience guessing about whether Cartman's transformation is genuine or simply an elaborate long-term prank aimed at humiliating Kyle one final time. This uncertainty mirrors Kyle's own suspicion almost perfectly, putting viewers in the exact same position as the character himself, unsure whether to trust what they are seeing on screen. The special ends without fully resolving this question, deliberately leaving the answer open heading into its direct sequel just a few weeks later. South Park post-COVID. The return of COVID picks up directly where the first special left off, following Stan, Kyle, and the rest of their old friend group as they work together to finish research, originally started by Kenny McCormick, aimed at using time travel to prevent the pandemic from ever happening in the first place. As the group works toward this goal, Cartman emerges as a direct obstacle standing in their way. Rather than supporting his old friends, adult Cartman forms an organization called the Foundation Against Time Travel, specifically built to stop Stan and Kyle from successfully changing the past. Working from a church building where his family has taken shelter during the ongoing pandemic crisis, Cartman recruits other characters to his cause, including Clyde Donovan and a version of Butters Stotch, who has descended into madness after being abandoned by his parents, now operating under the name Chaos and dealing in NFTs, a form of internet-based digital currency that becomes a recurring joke throughout the special. As tensions escalate, Cartman reveals a far darker motivation behind his resistance to the group's plan. He explains that his real goal all along has been to have Kyle killed in the past, ensuring that Kyle never survives long enough to grow into the adult currently trying to alter the timeline. This revelation seems to confirm every suspicion Kyle held throughout the earlier special, suggesting that Cartman's entire transformation, his marriage, his children, his religious devotion, may indeed have simply been an elaborate, decades-long setup aimed at finally destroying Kyle once and for all. However, the special pulls back from this dark twist before it fully plays out. As the conflict between Cartman's group and Kyle's group reaches its peak, Cartman's wife Yentl steps in directly, convincing her husband to allow Kyle and Stan to continue with their plan rather than following through with his violent scheme against Kyle. This intervention becomes the turning point that ultimately reveals the truth about Cartman's transformation. Rather than confirming Kyle's fears that everything had been fake, the special makes clear that Cartman's love for his wife and children, along with his devotion to his adopted faith, was genuinely real the entire time. His resistance to the time travel plan stemmed not from some master plan built purely around hurting Kyle, but from a desperate, deeply personal fear of losing the happy family life he had built for himself over the past 40 years, since altering the timeline risked erasing the very future in which his wife, his children, and his religious community existed at all. With this fear finally out in the open and addressed, Cartman ultimately chooses to step aside and allow the time travel plan to proceed, fully aware of exactly what that choice might cost him personally. Rather than preventing the pandemic outright, the group eventually discovers that stopping COVID entirely is simply not possible within the mechanics of their time travel technology. Instead, working alongside Randy Marsh and his supply of marijuana, they find a way to adjust how people throughout history respond to the pandemic emotionally and mentally, softening its long-term impact on society without erasing the disease itself from ever happening. This change reshapes the future for almost every character involved, giving most of the old friend group a noticeably better life than the one shown at the start of the original special. Randy's family life improves. Stan appears less burdened by depression. The overall state of society, while still dealing with ongoing pandemic-related challenges, becomes considerably less grim than the original bleak future first shown to audiences. Cartman, however, receives a very different outcome from everyone else. In this newly altered timeline, the happy family life he had built, his marriage to Yentl, his children, his standing as a respected rabbi, no longer exists at all. In its place, adult Cartman is now shown living alone, homeless, and struggling with alcoholism, cursing at Stan and Kyle from across the street when they happen to spot him near the end of the special. Rather than treating this outcome as a punishment Cartman somehow deserved, the special frames it as a genuine sacrifice on his part. Having understood exactly what he stood to lose by allowing the timeline to shift, Cartman still chose to let his friends move forward with their plan anyway, knowingly giving up his own personal happiness so that everyone else around him could end up with a better future. Watching him now, drunk and alone on the street, Stan and Kyle react with real sympathy rather than satisfaction, expressing genuine sadness over how his life turned out despite everything that happened between them over the years. Butters, watching the same scene unfold, refuses to indulge in any further pity for Cartman, insisting that nothing nothing could have realistically changed the path his life was always going to take, suggesting that some deeper part of Cartman's character may have always been destined to end up somewhere difficult, regardless of which version of the timeline he found himself living inside. This ending leaves the storyline in a strange, bittersweet place compared to every other Cartman-related storyline covered elsewhere in this video. Unlike the earlier episodes, where Cartman's anti-Semitism consistently leads directly to his own humiliation or defeat, this storyline flips that entire pattern on its head. Here, Cartman genuinely embraces the same faith he spent decades mocking, builds a real, loving family around that faith, and ultimately gives up his own happiness specifically to help the very people, including Kyle, who he spent his childhood tormenting. Rather than his hatred causing his downfall the way it does in nearly every other episode explored in this video, it is his capacity for genuine love and self-sacrifice that ends up costing him everything by the story's conclusion. At the same time, the special never fully lets go of Cartman's core personality either. Even after revealing that his conversion and family life were completely sincere, the show still finds room to have him plot Kyle's death and manipulate other characters throughout the second special, showing that whatever growth Cartman experienced over those 40 years did not erase every trace of his manipulative, self-interested instincts entirely. This mixture of real change and lingering old habits gives the storyline a complexity that stands apart from the more straightforward anti-Semitism-driven plots found in earlier decades of the show, presenting a version of Cartman who is neither fully redeemed nor exactly the same hateful child audiences first met back in 1997. Taken together, both post-COVID specials mark one of the most significant shifts the show has ever attempted regarding Cartman's relationship with Judaism and with Kyle himself. Where every previous storyline covered throughout this video kept Cartman locked firmly on the outside of Jewish identity, using it purely as a target for mockery, hatred, or manipulation, these specials briefly imagine a future where that same identity becomes something Cartman genuinely adopts as his own, complete with a family, a community, and an entire life built around it, even if that imagined future ultimately gets erased by the very friends he chooses to help save. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not long after this imagined future faded from the timeline the show settled back into, a very different kind of real-world controversy would pull Cartman back into familiar territory, this time using a real public figure whose own very public meltdown gave the show fresh, painfully current material to draw directly from the headlines once again. Section 09, Cupid Ye. Cupid Ye is the first episode of the 26th season of South Park and the 316th episode of the series overall. It was written and directed by Matt Stone and first aired on February 8th, 2023, time to arrive right around Valentine's Day. Before looking at the episode itself, it helps to understand the real-world event that inspired it. In the fall of 2022, the musician and designer known as Kanye West, who legally goes by the name Ye, made a string of anti-Semitic comments across social media and in public interviews. Among the most widely reported comments was a post on social media where he wrote that he planned to go DEFCON 3 on Jewish people, a phrase referencing the American military readiness scale known as DEFCON, used to signal how close the country might be to full-scale conflict. This post led to his accounts being suspended on both Twitter and Instagram. In the weeks that followed, major companies began cutting ties with him one after another. The sportswear company Adidas ended a hugely profitable partnership built around his Yeezy shoe line, a decision the company said would cost it up to $246 million in lost income for the year, explaining publicly that it did not tolerate anti-Semitism or any other form of hate speech. Around the same time, his talent agency dropped him, the fashion house Balenciaga cut ties with him, and several professional athletes signed to his sports marketing agency announced they were parting ways with him as well. This entire controversy was still fresh in the news when South Park sat down to write its season premiere just a few months later. The episode itself begins with a much smaller, more personal conflict at South Park Elementary. Kyle Broflovsky has been spending a growing amount of time with his classmate Tolkien Black, and the two of them have started making TikTok videos together that quickly become popular among the other students. Stan Marsh, watching this new friendship develop, starts to feel pushed aside and grows visibly upset that Kyle seems to be drifting away from him in favor of this new friendship with Tolkien. Cartman, noticing Stan's obvious jealousy, decides to take it upon himself to fix the situation, framing his decision to intervene as an act of good Christian behavior. Rather than addressing the situation honestly, Cartman starts spreading a false and anti-Semitic claim, telling Tolkien and other classmates that Jewish people, including Kyle specifically, have secretly appropriated black culture, and that new information has supposedly come out proving that Kyle personally runs Hollywood. Cartman's plan here directly imitates one of the most widely repeated anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in existence, the false and long debunked claim that Jewish people secretly control the entertainment industry, a claim with no basis in in reality that has been used for generations to spread hatred and suspicion toward Jewish communities. Assisting Cartman throughout this scheme is a character named Cupid Ye, an imaginary figure that only Cartman can see and interact with. Cupid Ye is a modified version of an earlier imaginary character called Cupid Me, who originally appeared years earlier in a different episode as a small winged version of Cartman himself, armed with a bow and arrow, and originally devoted to spreading feelings of love among the other students. For this episode, that same imaginary figure has been redesigned to look and act like Kanye West, adopting hip-hop style clothing along with a full set of anti-Semitic beliefs, directly mirroring the real rapper's public behavior during the exact same period the episode was written and released. As Cartman continues spreading his false claim about Kyle secretly controlling Hollywood, the school's PC principal eventually calls him into his office alongside Kyle, directly asking whether Cartman started the rumor himself. Cartman admits that he did, and the principal threatens him with 2 months of detention if the claim continues spreading through the school. Rather than stopping, Cartman keeps promoting the same false claim in media interviews outside of school, even as he privately admits to being uncomfortable with just how extreme and shocking some of Cupid Ye's own comments have become, mirroring the real-world pattern where even some of Kanye West's own supporters tried to downplay or excuse his comments rather than fully reckon with how serious they actually were. That night, Cupid Ye sneaks into Tolkien's bedroom window and whispers anti-Semitic conspiracy theories directly into his ear while he sleeps, suggesting that Kyle has been secretly profiting off their friendship and unfairly taking credit for Tolkien's own ideas and success. Tolkien's father, Steve Black, catches a brief glimpse of a shadowy figure escaping through the window, only realizing afterward that it was Cartman all along, sneaking away after planting these poisonous ideas in his son's mind. As these false claims continue spreading through the school, more and more students start repeating them without question, echoing exactly how quickly conspiracy theories and hateful claims spread among real audiences once a public figure with a large following starts repeating them out loud. Kyle grows increasingly frustrated and hurt watching people around him casually accept and repeat these baseless accusations, and the growing tension eventually causes a serious rift between him and Tolkien. During one heated argument, Kyle asks Tolkien how he would feel if people started claiming that black people secretly run the National Basketball Association, drawing a direct comparison meant to help Tolkien understand how deeply insulting and inaccurate this kind of blanket claim really is. Tolkien pushes back, pointing out that black people do not actually run the NBA, since the league's ownership and leadership positions remain overwhelmingly held by white executives and owners, a detail meant to highlight how absurd and factually backwards Cartman's original claim about Kyle running Hollywood really was from the very beginning. As the situation escalates further, Cupid Ye begins physically striking other students with his arrows, which no longer spread feelings of love the way they originally did earlier in the character's history. Instead, every student struck by one of these arrows becomes openly anti-Semitic themselves, repeating increasingly extreme and hateful claims about Kyle and Jewish people in general. This growing mob eventually turns on Kyle directly, confronting him with anger over completely unrelated grievances, including frustration over recent entertainment releases they associate, however illogically, with the idea that Jewish people supposedly control what gets made in Hollywood. With tensions reaching a dangerous peak, Stan and Tolkien step forward to defend Kyle against the growing crowd. Around this same moment, Cupid Ye steals a car and takes it on a destructive joyride through town, causing enough visible damage and chaos that Cartman himself becomes genuinely alarmed by what his imaginary creation has spiraled into. Realizing things have gone too far, Cartman physically confronts Cupid Ye and forces him to take medication, causing him to transform back into his original, more harmless form as Cupid Me, returning to his original purpose of spreading feelings of love among the students rather than hatred. In the aftermath of the entire ordeal, Kyle is invited to address a large public gathering where he attempts to correct the record and properly educate the crowd about the real history of Jewish involvement in the entertainment industry, explaining that the industry as a whole is actually run by tens of thousands of different people spread across the entire world, rather than controlled by any single group. Rather than fully absorbing this correction, members of the crowd instead become so moved by Kyle's speech that they begin suggesting he himself should personally take over and run Hollywood, an idea the crowd enthusiastically cheers for, much to Kyle's visible frustration, since the entire point of his speech had been to dismantle that exact claim rather than encourage it. This ending captures something distinct about how Cupid Ye chooses to handle its subject matter compared to the other episodes covered throughout this video. Rather than simply mocking a single anti-Semitic belief and letting it collapse under its own absurdity, the episode shows how difficult it can be to fully undo a false claim once it spreads widely enough, even when the person targeted by that claim stands up and directly refutes it using clear, simple facts. Kyle's attempt to correct the record accidentally gently reinforces the very stereotype he was trying to dismantle, showing just how sticky and self-reinforcing this particular kind of conspiracy thinking can become once enough people start repeating it casually among themselves. The episode also stands apart by drawing its central anti-Semitic conspiracy directly from real headlines that were still unfolding at the time it aired, rather than pulling from older historical events the way several earlier episodes covered in this video had done. By building Cupid Ye's design and behavior so closely around Kanye West's real public statements and consequences, the show placed its commentary directly inside an ongoing, unresolved news story, choosing to respond almost immediately rather than waiting for the controversy to settle before turning it into satire. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Where this episode used a real, still unfolding celebrity controversy to explore how quickly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories can spread through casual repetition, the show's next major storyline involving Kyle's Jewish identity would pull away from celebrity gossip and playground drama entirely, instead placing his own mother directly at the center of a real, ongoing international conflict still making headlines today. Section 10. Conflict of Interest. Conflict of Interest is the 5th episode of the 27th season of South Park. It was originally scheduled to air on September 17, 2025, but was delayed just hours before its planned broadcast because the episode was not finished in time, eventually airing 1 week later on September 24, 2025. The episode arrived during a period when the real-world war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza had already been an ongoing, deeply covered global news story for roughly 2 years, giving South Park a live, unresolved conflict to build its entire storyline around, rather than looking back at something already settled in the past. The episode opens with the children of South Park becoming completely absorbed in a new smartphone app built around prediction markets, a type of platform where users can place bets on the outcome of real-world events rather than sports games or casino-style gambling. This kind of app had become genuinely popular in the real United States around the time the episode aired, with people placing bets on everything from political outcomes to entertainment news. Within the show, the app quickly spreads through the entire school, with kids betting on an enormous range of situations happening both in their own town and in the wider world. Among the long list of bets available on the app, one in particular catches Kyle's attention and immediately upsets him. The app includes a wager asking whether Kyle's own mother, Sheila Broflovsky, will personally strike Gaza and destroy a Palestinian hospital. Kyle reacts with outrage, immediately confronting the situation and insisting that turning an active, deadly war into a casual betting market is deeply wrong, given the serious human cost still unfolding in real life. When Kyle first sees the bet, his instinct is to blame Cartman, assuming he must be behind it given his long history of targeting Kyle and his family. However, Cartman denies putting up the bet himself, and it's later shown that while he does try to profit off the wager by quietly encouraging others to bet on the opposite outcome to shift the odds in his favor, he did not actually create the bet in the first place. At one point, Cartman casually remarks that mentioning Gaza around a Jewish person makes them lose their composure instantly, a comment that captures his usual careless attitude toward the situation, treating a genuinely painful and complicated conflict as nothing more than an opportunity for a joke or a quick profit. Determined to get the bet taken down, Kyle tries pursuing the issue through official channels, eventually finding himself dealing with real government agencies referenced within the episode, including the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, a real regulatory body that oversees markets like the one depicted in the app, and the Federal Communications Commission, headed in the episode by a character based on its real chairman, Brendan Carr. This subplot ties into a separate storyline running through the same episode involving Donald Trump and a late-night television host being pressured off the air, though that portion of the episode does not connect directly to the Jewish-focused storyline covered here. As the bet continues gaining attention, news of its existence eventually reaches Sheila herself. She learns about it while spending time with other mothers at South Park Elementary, where the conversation quickly shifts away from the app itself and toward pointed questions about her own personal opinions on the war in Gaza, questions she clearly finds exhausting and unwelcome. At dinner with her family that same night, Sheila voices her frustration directly, complaining that everywhere she goes, people keep asking her specifically what she thinks should be done about Gaza, as though she personally carries some kind of responsibility or authority over the actions of an entire foreign government simply because of her own religion. She points out that nobody has bothered asking her husband, Gerald, for his opinion on the same subject, and when she asks him directly, he confirms that people only ever ask him what Sheila thinks, never what he personally believes. Sheila explains that she finds this deeply frustrating, since it treats American Jewish people as though they are collectively responsible for or connected to decisions made by the Israeli government, despite having no actual influence or control over that government at all. She specifically states that the situation situation is not accurately framed as Jews against Palestine, but rather as a conflict between the nations of Israel and Palestine, drawing an important distinction between a religious identity and a specific government's military and political decisions. She goes on to say that she is tired of being interrogated about her views on Palestine and Hamas, and judged for events going back centuries that most non-Jewish people asking her these questions know very little about in the first place. Rather than simply venting her frustration at home, Sheila decides to take direct action, traveling all the way to Israel herself. Back in South Park, this trip creates a wave of confusion and concern among the other townspeople, who assume, based on the very bet that started the whole controversy, that Sheila must be heading to Gaza specifically to carry out a violent attack on a hospital, exactly as the original wager had predicted. This assumption spreads through town and briefly convinces people that the outlandish betting market prediction might actually be coming true. The reality of Sheila's trip turns out to be something completely different. Rather than traveling to Gaza to cause any kind of destruction, Sheila instead makes her way directly to the office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a character based on the real political leader holding that position at the time. Arriving outside his office, Sheila leaves her taxi and forces her way through the surrounding security personnel, refusing to be turned away despite their objections. Once inside, she confronts Netanyahu directly and personally, demanding to know who he thinks he is, accusing him of flattening entire neighborhoods and killing thousands of people, then wrapping himself in his own Jewish identity as though that identity alone should shield him from any criticism or accountability for those actions. She tells him directly that his actions are making life harder for Jewish people everywhere, and specifically impossible for Jewish people living in America, who often find themselves being unfairly associated with decisions made by his government despite having no say in Israeli policy themselves. She insists that he knows exactly what he is doing and that his actions are deliberate rather than accidental, refusing to let him simply sit quietly through her confrontation. Drawing on her own long history of speaking her mind forcefully at school events back home, Sheila tells him she has plenty of experience standing her ground at parent-teacher association meetings and school board meetings, warning him that she is fully prepared to keep talking for as long as it takes to make her point heard. While this confrontation unfolds in Israel, the episode also includes a smaller moment where Kyle points out that the broader conflict between the region's different groups did not begin recently, noting that tensions in that part of the world have actually existed for thousands of years rather than starting with any single recent event, a detail meant to push back gently against the idea that casual bystanders fully understand the depth and history behind a conflict this old and complicated. Once the truth about Sheila's real reason for traveling to Israel becomes clear, Kyle explains to Cartman exactly what actually happened, correcting the earlier assumption that she had gone there to bomb a hospital as the original bet had predicted. This revelation catches Cartman in an uncomfortable position, since it becomes clear that he had personally placed a bet using his own mother's money, specifically wagering that Sheila would not bomb a hospital, all while quietly encouraging other people around him to bet on the opposite outcome in order to shift the betting odds more favorably in his own direction. Learning that Sheila's real trip involved confronting Netanyahu rather than committing any act of violence exposes Cartman's manipulation for exactly what it was, another attempt to profit personally off a situation involving Kyle's family and identity, regardless of how serious or sensitive the underlying subject actually was. By the end of the episode, Sheila emerges from her confrontation having stood her ground firmly against one of the most powerful political figures involved in the real conflict the episode is built around, refusing to let him dismiss or silence her the way he might dismiss ordinary criticism. Rather than being portrayed as an extremist or a violent figure, exactly as the original prediction market bet had framed her, Sheila instead comes across as someone directly and forcefully pushing back against a leader she believes is causing serious harm, both to the people directly affected by the war and to Jewish communities living far away from it, who find themselves unfairly blamed for decisions they have no part in making. Conflict of interest stands apart from every other episode covered throughout this video because it is the only one built around a war still actively happening in the real world at the exact moment the episode aired, rather than looking back at a settled historical event, a completed film release, or a resolved celebrity scandal. Where earlier episodes explored antisemitism through fictional monsters, secret societies, faked medical conditions, or a single celebrity's public meltdown, this episode plants Kyle's own mother directly inside a live, unfinished international crisis. Using her personal frustration over being unfairly associated with a foreign government's actions to explore a very specific, modern version of the same basic pattern seen throughout Kyle's entire family history on the show, being held responsible for something simply because of shared religious identity rather than any actual personal involvement or control. This also marks one of the only times across the entire history of the show that a member of Kyle's Kyle's own family, rather than Kyle himself, becomes the direct target of an outside assumption tied to their Jewish identity, shifting the weight of that familiar pattern away from the children's storylines that dominate most of the other episodes covered in this video and placing it instead onto an adult character forced to confront a real political leader face to face over decisions made an ocean away from her own home. Across every episode explored throughout this entire video, from Kyle's earliest days as the only Jewish kid in a town full of Christian families, through Cartman's decades-long campaign of hatred, faked conditions, invented monsters, celebrity obsessions, and finally, a real-world war still playing out in current headlines, one thread holds every single one of these stories together. Kyle's identity, and by extension his family's identity, consistently becomes the exact thing other people project their own fears, assumptions, and hatred onto, regardless of how little any of it actually has to do with Kyle himself. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.